Acts 25 1-27, through the Bible. Chapter 25. Theme: Paul before Festus. Paul had been unjustly kept in prison for 2 years. Festus is the new governor who followed Felix. Now, Paul will appear before this new governor. We have seen Paul before the mob, on the steps of the castle in Jerusalem. We have seen him before the Sanhedrin. We have seen him before Felix, and then in private interview, with Felix and his wife Drusilla. Apparently, there were other meetings. Now, he will appear before Festus. Later, he will appear before Agrippa. Paul appeared before all these rulers, and it must have been a tedious time for Paul, something to try his patience. However, I'm sure that he rejoiced, in the opportunity given him, to testify before the high political figures of the Roman Empire. Remember, that when the Lord Jesus had apprehended Paul on the Damascus road, he had said, "He is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles, and kings, and the children of Israel." Acts 9:15. Paul is moving according to God's plan and program. Each time, Paul tells about what the Lord Jesus had done for him, and he tells it with a great deal of conviction and enthusiasm. Paul witnesses a good confession of Jesus Christ. Although Felix trembled as he listened, the rascality, and cupidity, and covetousness of this man triumphed. He had his chance. He sent for Paul many times, but he wanted a bribe, not salvation. Those 2 years that Paul languished in prison, are silent years in the life of Paul. Perhaps, he chafed under it all. We don't know. We do know, that the hand of God was manifested in all this, and his purposes were carried out. How comforting this can be for us, when our activity seemingly comes to a standstill. Paul appears before Festus. Now, when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest, and the chief of the Jews, informed him against Paul, and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way, to kill him. But Festus answered, that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Acts 25 1-4. It seems that Festus understood the situation. I'm of the opinion, that Felix told him about Paul's imprisonment, and I think he explained the circumstances. I'm sure he told Festus, that he had brought him to Caesarea, to protect him from being put to death by the Jews. So, when Festus gets word from the Jews, that they want Paul in Jerusalem, he says, "Oh, I won't bring him down here. I'm going back to Caesarea myself. I'm not going to stay around in Jerusalem." Here was another Roman, who preferred Caesarea to Jerusalem. The enemies of Paul, certainly didn't waste any time, getting to the new governor, to try to get a judgment against Paul. I don't know whether Festus was actually aware of their plan, to ambush the party and kill Paul. I think he was, but it doesn't really say that he knew about it. However, he refused to accede to their demands, and requested instead, that they come to Caesarea to bring charges. "Let them, therefore," said he, "which among you are able, go down with me, and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him." And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem, stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Acts 25 5-7. Paul is again called upon to defend himself, against the accusations of the Jews. However, it provides an opportunity, to present the gospel to Festus. While he answered for himself, "Neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended anything at all." But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul, and said, "Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me?" Acts 25 8-9. This Festus is another rascal. Paul is not only in the midst of a den of thieves, he is in the midst of a bunch of rascals. Then said Paul, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest." Acts 25:10. There are some people, who think that Paul made a mistake here, that he should never have appealed to Caesar. They think, he should simply have let his case rest with Festus. Friend, don't you see that Festus was going to use Paul, for his own political ends? Festus was going to take Paul back to Jerusalem. Perhaps, Festus was receiving bribes from the Jews, who had come from Jerusalem. I am reluctant to criticize Paul. I don't think that he made a mistake here. Paul was a Roman citizen, and he exercised his rights as a citizen, which was the normal and the right thing for him to do. Going back to Jerusalem would have surely meant death for him. He doesn't purposely make himself a martyr. In fact, he did what he could to avoid martyrdom. Friend, there are people today who wear a hair shirt, and God didn't give it to them. In other words, they like to take the position of a martyr. I've had a number of people who have told me that I should rejoice that I have cancer, because now I can suffer for Christ, and maybe die for Christ. Well, I can tell you, I don't feel that way about it. I want to get rid of the cancer. I want to live. I think a person is depressed spiritually and mentally if he wants to put on a hair shirt and lie on a cold slab. Martin Luther tried that, and he found it didn't accomplish anything. You will remember that 2 years before this, the Lord had appeared to Paul and had promised him a trip to Rome, Acts 23:11. That's what is taking place. He went to Rome by the will of God. He was in chains, but the Lord hadn't told him how he would get to Rome. This was God's method for him. When Paul wrote to the Romans, he told them that he was praying to be able to come to Rome, and he asked them to pray that he might be able to come, Romans 1:9-10, 15:30-32. I believe he went to Rome by the will of God. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die, but if there be none of these things, whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar, Acts 25:11. I detect a note of impatience here. Rome was noted for its justice, and Paul respected authority. However, Paul is not getting justice, and so he makes a legal appeal. God intended that Paul use his rights as a Roman citizen. It is very interesting for us to observe that God leads some people in one way, and leads others in another way. Some of the others could not claim the protection of Roman citizenship. I knew a wonderful Christian man and wife, whom the Lord had blessed in a material way. They had built a lovely home, a home in which it was always a delight to visit. The man told me that he felt under conviction, because he had a lovely home, and he wanted to open his home, and use it for Christian witnessing and testimony, as much as possible. So I asked him, did you ever stop to think that God blessed you materially, and gave you such a nice home, because he knew you were the kind of a man who would use his home for him? Then I said to him, you just go ahead, and fall into a sweet sleep every night, knowing that you are in the will of God, and thanking him for that lovely home. Now, the Lord didn't give me that kind of a home, because evidently, he doesn't intend for me to use my home for that type of thing. What has the Lord done for you, friend? Whatever it is, you should use it for him. If you are in a political position, you should use that position for him. If the Lord has put something in your hand, use it for him. Remember that Moses had a rod in his hand, just a rod, but he was to use it for God. That is the whole thought here. Paul had his Roman citizenship. It was a rod in his hand. He's going to use it. Use it for God. I don't think that Paul made a mistake here. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go, Acts 25:12. Festus is forced to concur with Paul at this point. He cannot prevent Paul from going to Rome, to the court of Caesar. King Agrippa and Bernice come to visit Festus. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea, to salute Festus, Acts 25:13. Festus had just come into office, as the new governor, so the king comes over for a visit. I have a notion that these politicians work together. They all belong to the same party. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him, Acts 25:14-15. Agrippa and Bernice stayed there, quite a long time. Dr. Luke calls it many days. Finally, they ran out of conversation. Even a king and a governor finally run out of things to talk about. When there was a lull in the conversation, Festus said, Oh, by the way, I should tell you about a prisoner that we have here. It's a rather odd, unusual case. His name is Paul, and he was arrested and brought down here by Felix. Felix left him for me. I'd like you to hear him. To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans, to deliver any man to die, before that, he which is accused, have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself, concerning the crime laid against him. Acts 25:16. I'd like to call your attention to this. We sometimes think that Roman law was not just, because we have seen how it went awry, in the case of the Lord Jesus, and also in the case of the Apostle Paul. However, this was not because of the law, but because of the crooked politicians. We still operate under the principle of Roman law, that no man is to be sentenced, until he has been brought into the presence of his accusers, and his crime be established. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat, and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation, of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him, of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Acts 25:17-19. The issue is always the same, it is the resurrection. We see from this, that Paul had witnessed to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, so that Festus knew about it. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and there, be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed, to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept, till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. Acts 25:20-22. Actually, Festus was in a sort of hot seat here. The charge against Paul was sedition, and for that, he should die, but he had committed no crimes. Now, Paul has appealed to Caesar. What are you going to do with a prisoner like that? So, he asked Agrippa to help him out. I'm of the opinion that Agrippa had previously heard about Paul, and was actually anxious to hear him. He wanted to know more about the charges, and he wanted to hear what Paul would have to say. So, they arranged for a meeting. It is interesting to see how this meeting was arranged, by a king and a governor. Yet, all the while, they were actually fulfilling prophecy, even though they were unaware of this. Paul is to appear before kings, as the Lord had said. The hearing before Festus and Agrippa. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing, with the chief captains, and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. Acts 25:23. What a scene this was! Wherever did a preacher have a greater audience than this man? The setting is dramatic, with great pomp and ceremony. Paul appears in chains, before this august company of rulers and kings. Festus is asking Agrippa to help him frame a charge against Paul, to send him to Caesar. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men, which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem, and also here, crying, that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him. Of whom, I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore, I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that, after examination, had I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Acts 25:24-27. Paul uses this opportunity to preach one of the greatest sermons ever recorded.